Hey guys, it's part 4 of the discussion from the Letters from Christoper book. We just wanted to start off really quick by saying how much we appreciate all of the great comments and feedback and the likes and subs that we've gotten from these videos. We really are overwhelmed by the response. So just wanted to say thank you for your support. We're starting off at chapter 18, which is we are back at the Frederick PD, and Chris is about to give his first confession to agents Tammy Lee and Graham Coder, and he had just bombed the polygraph. The agents have placed a picture of Bella and Cece down in front of Chris, and they are trying to get him to confess, but he's still trying to deny that he had anything to do with it. So then they tell him that they appreciate him coming in to take the polygraph, even though he knew he wasn't going to pass it. And then they told him that they know that he stayed because he needed to get everything off of his chest. And they asked him to start from the beginning and tell them everything that happened. This is where Coder starts in on his two Chris's thing. And Agent Coder says, I don't understand why there are two Chris's. And then Chris responds with, because he knows that they know he's lying, so he's scrambling in his horrible lying brain to come up with some kind of reason he would show deception. So his answer is to just blurt out with, I cheated on her. I'm not proud of it. She accused me of it. I denied it. I feel horrible for it. Like, she was pregnant. I didn't hurt her. I cheated on her. I hurt her emotionally. So that's his out with, look, I'll be honest with you. This is the whole deception. Just one of, another poor attempt at deflection. Then he starts talking about Nicole Kessinger, except he's calling her the whole time. And they're asking him her name, and he's saying he doesn't want to get her involved because she's already been through enough. And, but he starts in with that whole stuff about she took his breath away, and he never thought in a million years he could feel like this about someone. And then he says, he actually tells him, the affair is the only thing he was holding back. And so they remind him that he was not questioned about infidelity on the polygraph and that they already knew about his girlfriend, Nikki. So if you do watch the 9 hours of his interrogation and polygraph that's on YouTube, you can see that they employ all different kinds of, I don't know any other term, but mindfuckery with him. And it's really fascinating to watch all of the different tactics they use throughout this whole thing. But they go into another one right here, and I believe it's Agent Coder asks him, tells him, we have your Alexa and it's claimed to record distress. They're trying to get him to admit anything. And then they also remind him that they're going to have the contents of all of his texts, Shanann's, and Nikki's texts. And then they again ask him to circle back and go back through the evening. Chris again reiterates that he got up at 4, woke Shanann up at 4:15, and they go into this emotional talk about the separation. And then he keeps saying that he could not bring himself to admit the affair. And he mentions that Shanann asks him about the $68 dinner charge and asks, why he had that. And this is interesting because, on August 11th, the night before, after he dropped Nicole off at her apartment and was driving back, and he was late to get back, about 30 minutes, I believe, there is a call between he and Shanann, and she asks him about the charge and tells him to save the receipt. So again, yet another example of a conversation that happened another day that he's bringing into this emotional conversation. The agent tells Chris that he has a hard time believing he had an emotional conversation with Shanann where they both were crying, yet they have yet to see him shed one tear over the 2 days that they've been interviewing him. And then Chris responds by saying he loves his girls, and it didn't mean anything that he hadn't shed any tears. And at that point, he has a well-timed sniffle. He also tells the agents that he loves his girls to death. Agent Lee reminds him that the only way that Shanann could have possibly left was in Chris's truck. And Chris says, there's no way, because, I didn't just throw them in my truck. She reminded him that his truck had GPS installed and asked him if he knew the GPS should ping every 10 seconds, and he said yes, he knew that. And then she told him they were going to find out exactly where he went, and he said, I know. And this is where we get into the infamous territory that started all kinds of crazy drama and ridiculous theories with the agent saying, are we not asking you the right questions? And he replies, you're asking all the questions. And then the agents ask him what they're doing wrong, and he says they're not doing anything wrong. And this is where they start going down the road of did Shanann do something to get him to confess anything, try a different tactic? And he says, I don't think she did anything to those kids. After kind of giving some old cases and leading him down this road, Agent Lee finally asks, what did Shanann do to the girls? And then Chris immediately wants to talk to his dad. And the agent says that the dad can come in, that Ronnie can come in, but she says, will you tell your dad what happened? And Chris just keeps reiterating he wants to speak to his dad. He's been there 5 to 6 hours. And then they go and get Ronnie in the lobby, and they tell Ronnie that Chris wants to talk to him, and they also explain that everything in that room is going to be recorded. If this sounds like stuff you guys already know, it's because it is. At this point, she's just rehashing discovery. So Ronnie gets into the interrogation room, and basically Chris just says, I failed the polygraph, and they said they're not going to let me go. And he basically starts out by saying that the police knew he had an affair. There isn't much shock on his face at this point, which has led a lot of people to believe that his family already knew about the affair. And then Chris tells him that when he and Shanann had a conversation that morning, it was emotional. And then he starts saying, I don't want to protect her. I don't want to protect her, but I don't know what else to say. And then Ronnie asks him what happened, and Chris replies, she hurt them. He says, and then I freaked out and I hurt her. And his dad asked if that's when Shanann took the girls and left. And Chris is stuttering and trying to get out what he's trying to tell his dad. And Ronnie says, talk to me and tell me what happened. And Chris whispers, she smothered them. They were smothered. And Ronnie immediately says, they what? And then Chris says, she strangled them, and then pauses and says, they were smothered. Ronnie responds with, she smothered him or choking him? And Chris responds by saying, I didn't hear anything. When I was downstairs, I came back up and they were gone. I don't know, me, and he's stuttering all over the place, talking about the separation and everything, about, I don't know, what else to say, because I freaked out and I did the same thing to fucking her. Those were my kids. So then Ronnie asks if Shanann freaked out over the separation talk that they had, and Chris says that Shanann laid back down when he went downstairs and he heard a little commotion upstairs but didn't really think much about it. And then when he went back upstairs, he saw Shanann on top of Celeste. And Ronnie asks him, was she choking Celeste, and did Shanann kill Celeste? And then Chris just responds with, they were blue. Ronnie asks Chris, both of them? And Chris says yes. Ronnie asked if Shanann choked both of them to death, and Chris kind of sidesteps that and says, I freaked out and did the same fucking thing to her. And Ronnie, who is obviously in shock at this point, says, oh my God. Then Chris explains he didn't call the police about what happened, and Ronnie responds with, so then what'd you do, haul the bodies off or something? And Chris said he didn't know what else to do, and he freaked out. So keep in mind at this point, they both know that this is being recorded. Ronnie reiterates again that Shanann choked both of them to death, and that Chris just lost it and then choked Shanann. And Chris goes along with that, and he's like, it's rage. And as we know now, he says that he didn't have rage at all until he got to the oil fields. And then basically Chris looks at his dad and says, this will be the last time I will see the light of day. And then Ronnie asks if the FBI knows what happened and says that he wants to be the first one to tell them. And Ronnie says, well, we need to get a good lawyer and find out what the hell they can do. At this point, the agents come back in, and obviously they've been watching, but they're going to get the official version from Chris from his first confession. So he launches into his first confession, which we know isn't true, but in a lot of places, it looks like he just transposed Shanann for the things that he did. And again, we can go into this more when we get into his final confession, because he basically flips kind of this thing that I've noticed he does. But in this confession, it almost seems like he hyper-focuses on Celeste over Bella. When he talks about Bella, he says that he saw that her covers were kicked off and he figured that she was just hot on the baby monitor. But he really goes into, in detail, what Celeste looked like and how Celeste was, which is interesting because he does pretty much the exact opposite in the newest version, which I think is telling in a lot of ways. But he says that the baby monitor cycled over to Celeste's bedroom and that Shanann was in there with her on top of her. He said he freaked out and ran into Celeste's bedroom and got on top of Shanann. He said that Celeste was blue. He also says that Celeste's head was kind of to the side, and I'm sorry for these details, but this is part of the confession, that her head was to the side, and then he looked at her and he could see that she was not breathing. And he never says that about Bella. So then the agents are asking him where they are, and he says that they're at Survey 319, and they ask him how he picked that spot, and he says it was just the first place that he went to that day, which Discovery shows is not true. It looks like he's been planning it since around at least Celeste's birthday. And then they ask him if he wants to go out there, and Chris says there's no way he wants to go out there. And they say they have a map of the site, and he could maybe just point it out for them and get them out of the cold. And then, of course, Chris goes back to his main priority, which is what does everyone think of him? And he actually, after all of this, he asked the agents not to think any less of him. Then they go back into what happened that night. And he says that he saw Shanann with her hands, on top of Celeste. And he again mentions that Celeste was already blue and not moving, and that he went into this blind rage. They do ask him if he went into Bella's room, and he says he just knew she was gone by the way she was sprawled out. I again think this is important and that it will come into play later. Agent Lee asked Chris if Shanann fought back, and he said not much because he had a lot of rage. And we know from what he told the author in this version, allegedly, that he now corrects it. He didn't have any rage, actually, and he was very calm when he did this, but that she didn't fight back because she couldn't. And I know there's been so much debate, understandably, about this, because we know that Shanann would have fought for herself and her life and her unborn baby and her babies, but it's so easy to say that when you're not in the situation. I think there's a couple different things, obviously, that could have happened. Either she walked in, got upstairs, and was grabbed from behind, and wouldn't have had a chance to fight back in that situation, really. I mean, you're in survival mode. There's not a heck of a lot you can do. And even if she did it the other way, that's very possible, which is he was in that bed with his back turned to her, as he basically says in this first one. His back was turned to her. He felt her get into the bed. I think this is also extremely likely. She gets into bed, and as she starts to fall asleep, because we know he's antsy and he's short on time, so he would be waiting to the first possible moment that he could get away with this. And we also know him to be a complete coward. So I keep going back and forth, but I keep going back to the fact of what a coward he is, and he never wanted to talk to her or admit anything. So it would make sense if she started to fall asleep and he rolls over and maybe from behind, pinches her jugular and waits till she loses consciousness, which could only be 20 seconds. So think about if you're exhausted, you're falling asleep, and that happens. How much fight are you going to be able to put up? You're in shock. You're trying to figure out what's happening. And around that time, you're losing consciousness. So I think that's entirely possible. And then he possibly turned her on her back and straddled her to get better leverage and finish it off. But I know that there's been a lot about that, about her fighting back, but I don't think that she really could. I agree with him here. At this point, Ronnie is looking through Facebook, and he points out the doll pic that Shanann posted on the 9th to the agents. And he says he doesn't think that Bella would have done this. This isn't the way that she played with dolls. And then ironically, Ronnie says, I'm thinking this might have been planned. I don't know. The agents are pressing him again about where they are. They want to go get them. And Chris, again, shows more emotion when they ask about the coworker accompanying them out to Survey 319. And when she suggests that, he flips out again because it's about his own self and his reputation, and says, oh my God, no. And they'll be like, what the fuck did you do, Chris? Why didn't you just tell the cops to begin with? So he completely flips out at the idea of his coworkers thinking bad of him. Chapter 19 talks about locating Shanann and the girls. And so Ronnie leaves the room briefly, and the agents walk back in, and they put down the colored photograph, and they point to where the sheet is on there, and then there's the overturned dirt, and they ask Chris where they are. And Chris points to the area where the overturned dirt is, and that says that Shanann is there. And then he points to the tanks and says that Bella and Celeste are in the tanks. And then they give him a pen, and they ask him to mark where everyone's located. So he put an S where Shanann was, and then a B and a C on each oil tank to indicate where Bella and Celeste were located. Bella's body was in the west tank, which had approximately 1.4 feet of oil in it, and Celeste was in the east tank, which had approximately 9 feet of crude oil in it. He then goes back to describing, they want to jump back and describe again what Shanann did, and I don't know I get something very particular out of this part, and I'd love to see, without me influencing it, if you guys get the same thing. But it's going back to what I talked about before, where he again goes into Celeste's description, very detailed. He says, again, Celeste was blue and limp. He said he's never seen anything like it in his life, and that Celeste was laid over. She wasn't moving at all and wasn't gasping for breaths. He said she was just totally blue. He then again says that he didn't witness Bella being murdered, but that she was just sprawled out lying on the bed. So again, he's very tuned into Celeste, but doesn't seem like he knows much about Bella besides that she was laying sprawled out on the bed. He doesn't have any descriptive words like he does with Celeste. And then, of course, Agent Lee is saying, that she's been a parent, and any of us that are parents know that even if you see that your child is blue and limp, you're going to do everything that you can. Your instinct is going to call 911 and see if by some miracle they can revive their child. And he's still trying to feed her the line of crap that he just didn't know what to do, and the rage took over. So naturally, his only choice was to drive out to the oil tanks. The agents also say that they think the girls were dead before Shanann got home, and he kind of says no, but his voice trails off. And then they also ask him if Shanann ever went to bed when she got home, and he says all of that is true. He also makes it a point to say that she was wearing the same clothes when she was murdered as then when he took her out to Survey 319. The agents ask Chris about Nicole and Chris's 111-minute phone conversation on August 12th. And according to Nicole's phone records, she called Chris at 9:28 p.m. and they talked for 111 minutes, which I believe, what does that put them at, about 11:19 p.m. And remember that Shanann was supposed to get home originally land at 10:30, but with the trip from DIA to there would put her home right around 11 o'clock. So he says that they were just talking about their day like normal. We can just, no matter what we know from here, we know that that's complete lie. This is a huge deal. Shanann's coming home. Everything's going to change. No matter what you believe they were talking about, they were at least talking about, what are you going to do when she gets home? Probably, where are you going to sleep tonight? What are you going to say to her? And who knows? I mean, there's a lot of other people that think something completely else was discussed. But the timing is interesting. And then Nicole says that she doesn't remember what they talked about, of course, and that she could hear the TV on really loud in the background, which I think is another clue, obviously. And then this time he says they were having phone sex, and I touched on this in the other one, but she brings it up again that they talk about the 111-minute phone call. They ask Chris why the sheets are in the trash, and he explains that he used the fitted sheet to wrap Shanann and take her to the site, and then he threw all the other sheets and pillowcases away. And then they ask him about the tanks, and they mention that their agents could, barely fit their arms into the tanks. So how did he fit them in there? And they ask him if it was difficult, and he says, no, not really. They ask him if he had to push them down. He says, no. We know now that he says that he did with Bella, not really with Cece. Then he actually mentions to them that because of the splashes, Bella's tank sounded emptier than Celeste. They ask him if he's sure that he did not put the girls in the tanks when they were alive, and he says, no, God, no, 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 no. God, no, God, no. And they ask if he ever went to check back on Bella, and he says, yes, Bella was blue in the face and not moving, and he didn't hear anything such as a pulse or a beat of any kind, which now that we know his other version of, allegedly taking Celeste up and then coming down and Bella being alive, I guess I just wonder how, and he says he was in a rage and pressed for time. It just kind of makes you wonder. Chapter 20 goes into when they went out to recover the bodies, and it has them going out there on August 15th, 2018 at 2 p.m. And 2 CBI agents met with other police agents and some other people from Anadarko at the Love's truck stop in Hudson, Colorado. And in a weird coincidence, I had to drive to Sterling, Colorado on this August 15th, exactly 1 year later. And I didn't think about the date until later, and I also didn't know it was going to be on the route. And when I was looking down at my GPS, I saw I was going to be going right by Roggin. So I pulled off at the truck stop and just to see what it was like. I've never been out there before. And you can only get about 0.3 of a mile within the tank range because there's so many don't trespass and private property signs. And then you can see them way out in the distance, but they're pretty far out there. It cuts to when the agents are out there and they've already found the sheet, of course, and the overturned dirt, and then they get word that Chris has confessed. So they bring them the picture and show them where he says that everyone is. They then went through the process of getting Shanann out of the grave and collecting all the evidence, bagging up her hands. They did say that she was so decomposed that they couldn't identify her by pictures. They just went on the fact that it was her based by what Chris told them where he had buried her. By the time they got her out of there and everything was processed, it was midnight, so they knew they were going to have to come back and get the girls the next morning. So rescue workers got out there first thing in the morning and began the process with the hazmat gear. And as we know, they had to take a lot of precautions. And it was a pretty painstaking, horrific experience for all of them to get the girls out of the tanks. And they took the bolts off of the bottom doors and had a process of having to remove the sludge and filter it to make sure they weren't losing any evidence. And then they had to go in and, very carefully remove the bodies and make sure that they could do it as gently and without losing any evidence as possible. They did find Celeste first in the east tank. She was face down and she was wearing a pink nightgown and her pull-up. So once outside the tank, there was a doctor who tried to pat her little stomach area down with oil-absorbent pads. They both had a lot of skin slippage, as we know, so they gently put her in a white sheet and then laid her inside the bag to go to the morgue. Bella's recovery was much faster than Celeste's because her tank had much less oil in it, barely had over 1 foot, so it didn't take them as long to pump it out. The agent went to the top and looked in the thief hatch, and he said he could see her body that appeared to be face up on the south side of that tank. And if you read the discovery, you'll see how horrific and dangerous this process was. The CBI agents had to constantly monitor the girls' bodies with a 4-gas meter. And then at the entrance to the tanks, they also had to constantly monitor those and make sure that it wasn't too dangerous and that it was safe for them to go into the tanks and get the girls out. And again, I apologize for any graphic details. If that's not something you want to hear, just fast forward maybe about 10 or 15 seconds. But it's still, if you read the discovery, you'll see how horrible this process was for these first responders. And my heart definitely goes out to them with what happened with Celeste's arm when they were and they were very gentle with them and very caring. And, they had so much skin slippage with Celeste's left arm. The skin it degloved. And then with Bella, the same thing. They put her on the plywood and her skin came off on the plywood. And it was just, I'm sure that mentally they will never recover from that. And I only bring that up, well, because one, it's the facts of what happened. But two, it never ceases to amaze me how one person's actions can have a ripple effect and affect so many people. In chapter 21, the author goes into the autopsies, and she writes at the beginning, the following is not the full autopsies, it's the observations of the autopsies. So on Friday, August 17th at approximately 10 a.m., 2 CBI agents, along with several others, gathered for the autopsy of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. The autopsy was done at the McKee Medical Center, which is in Loveland, Colorado. Shanann's autopsy was performed first. She was wearing a purple-gray t-shirt, black bra, blue thong underwear, which they removed and collected as evidence. She had a large amount of skin slippage, and as we know, she did have the coffin birth, which in this last version, Chris says that he thinks when he put her in there, she'd given birth, which is not true. I would love to hear someone who could, counter that, because from what I've read on it and people that I've talked to that work in that field, it takes some time for the gases to build up and for that to happen. So yet another bizarre lie of his. But anyway, they collected the amniotic sac and her fetus, Nico, and they collected it as evidence and sent it to the CBI lab. The coroner advised that Shanann's hyoid bone was not broken, although he pointed out that she did have some soft tissue bruising on the right side of the bone. The coroner didn't find any other trauma to Shanann's body, and he found no evidence of disease. He ruled her cause of death as asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. The second autopsy was performed on 4-year-old Bella, and Bella was in a pink nightgown covered in butterflies and a pair of underwear, which was also collected as evidence. She had a large amount of skin slippage. She was also put through the same x-rays And they also had a concern that she may have a broken jaw. The x-rays were sent to the children's hospital, and they said she didn't have an actual fracture. It was just gas in that area of the jaw. It also appeared that Bella had some scrapes to her buttocks and tops of her shoulders. The doctor pointed out several important findings. He advised Bella's frenulum, or skin connecting the top lip to the gum, was torn, which created a large hole. The inside of Bella's gums and inner lip also appeared bruised, and it appeared she had bitten her tongue. The doctor indicated that Bella's death was violent, as it appeared, and she struggled to get away. The doctor's preliminary cause of death for Bella was asphyxiation due to manual smothering. Bella also had oil in her stomach, and Celeste did not. The final autopsy was performed on 3-year-old Celeste. Celeste was dressed in a pink nightgown, Minnie Mouse underwear, and a pull-up. The nightgown and underwear were collected as evidence. Celeste also had a large amount of skin slippage. She didn't have any other signs of injury or bruising on her neck. She also didn't have any of the injuries to her mouth or face, such as Bella did, or any petechia. The doctor advised that Celeste's preliminary cause of death was asphyxiation due to manual smothering. The author ends chapter 21 with the definition of sane. She writes, "The definition of sane is being of sound mind, not mad or mentally ill, able to think or reason clearly, lucid, clear-headed, rational, coherent, balanced, well-balanced, stable, and normal." She then opines, Christoper does not fit the description of a sane person with what he did, so is he insane? Then she writes the definition of insane, in a state of mind which prevents normal perception, behavior, or social interaction, deranged, demented, out of one's mind, unhinged, unbalanced, unstable, and disturbed. So she asks the question, was Christoper's behavior more of this definition? Could he be right about being possessed and being surrounded by an evil presence? The definition of possessed is being completely controlled by an evil spirit, of a demon or spirit, especially an evil one, having complete power over someone and being manifested through their speech or actions. Chapter 22 doesn't really have much in it. I'll just touch on the two things it did. It just says that by the time the search was done, they had searched the house 3 times with Chris's consent. And then she goes over what the items that were collected. The items that were collected at Survey 319, it says 219. That's driving me nuts for some reason. At Survey 319 oil site for evidence are 2 plastic bags, the gray and white sheet. The sheet had red stains on it, and the sheet was covered in dirt. The rake head, the rake handle, and then, of course, the suspected hair from the east tank, which was the tank that Cece was in. Even though in the last version, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, we'll get back to that, but I believe he says it's Bella's hair, and it's the wrong tank, and it's Cece's hair. The evidence collected from Shanann was the blue thong-style underwear that had the dirt on it, the shirt with the heart that we've seen, the black bra, and then they had the oral swabs from Celeste, Bella, and Shanann. Chapter 23, we are treated with reflections from Christoper. And so automatically, you know how rooted in reality those will be. I almost didn't want to read it, but since that's the whole point of this video, I'm going to just go over it like any other chapter, but just to let you know, it's pretty much exactly what you would expect. She writes, following are the reflections of Christoper shared with me through informal conversations. This is Chris. How does a person sum up his life in a few paragraphs? I'm only 34 years old, and just like my family, my life stopped at this age. It's a difficult sentence to say. No, not just like your family. You had a choice. Your family had none. So he says, I took my own life. I lost my family, my house, my job, my friends, everything that meant anything to me. I now know Shanann and I were not meant for each other. I'm afraid if I tell you my thoughts, you might feel I'm blaming Shanann for what happened, but I'm not at all. We were just 2 completely different people, each with our own views and personalities. Mostly opposites attract and do well. That wasn't the case with us. When I really think about it, I wasn't true to myself when I first met her. Shanann was so beautiful, I remember. I just couldn't relax and be myself around her. She was confident and a real presence. I am quiet and I like the background. Again, I can't read his whole 4-page soliloquy here for copyright reasons, but I'm just picking out his main points. He says, "Our wedding day was the happiest day of my life. When I think of good memories, I definitely think of that day. We had a beautiful wedding, and no bride could have been more gorgeous than Shanann. When I think back on what I had, I still cannot believe I lost my whole family, a family I had wanted my whole life. It's the most horrible thing I could ever do. I'm still saying it was not my mind or my hands that did this, but the hands and mind being controlled by something evil. I hope people will believe me. I needed to rise to the occasion and be a man, to help my wife see she could not control everything and everyone around her, and if she couldn't come to terms with that, then split. I was not able to confront the situation, though. I could not go to Shanann and tell her my feelings. The big house was totally Shanann's idea. I knew we could not afford it, but as usual, I wanted to make Shanann happy and would not tell her no. We had the house built when we first moved to Colorado. Our house payments were $2,800 a month, with the $500 of that being insurance. That was not including the HOA fees. Shanann spent a lot of our money. I felt completely trapped because how would I ever be able to afford my own apartment when we never had an extra dollar? Well, there you go, is another part of his motive. He couldn't afford his own apartment with Nicole. He then continues to rant on and on about all of the things that Shanann did wrong and how he was the injured party. He goes on to talk about how his health was always very important to him and he loved to work out, and that Shanann resented his working out. It sure doesn't look like that from her Facebook posts. I will say that. She seems really proud of him for all of the weight that he's lost, and is always showing pictures of him working out, and like she's really proud of how he looks. But this is his perspective. He also writes about how Shanann used to get dressed in running clothes and then have him take pictures of her and pretend she would work out, but she wouldn't actually work out. And then he talks about how that was something that him and Nicole Kessinger talked about. They would sit there and talk about how awful it was that Shanann didn't support him working out, and that was one of the reasons he wanted a divorce. I just want to say really quick that I'm not trying to be disrespectful with my caption at all or this part. I hope that the girls are at peace and in heaven and not, are far away from what they went through that night. It's just this part, you'll see, I'm going to end it with this for this chapter, but it just seems to me yet again, he's just so detached and minimalizing and trivializing what he's done. So he writes, "After I was in prison and after I was moved to Wisconsin, I received a letter from a woman I didn't know, and she said she didn't know me. She had heard something briefly on the television about the case, but said she really didn't pay much attention to it, so she was not at all familiar with the story. She wrote me about a dream she had a couple nights before she wrote me. In her dream, she was walking past a room and saw a baby bed in the room and could hear a small child crying. She walked into the room and noticed something was dripping out from under the baby's bed. It was dripping onto the floor. She walked over to the bed, looked, and saw a little girl covered in liquid. It was all over the child. So she picked up the little girl, who said, 'I'm having so much fun up here.' The woman realized the small child was covered in gas. She woke up and was very disturbed by the dream. She remembered something about gasoline from the news. She didn't remember my name or anything else pertaining to the case, so she Googled it and found the story. When she saw pictures of my family, she told me she realized by the little girl in her dream was Bella. She said she was writing me to let me know that they're in heaven and I didn't need to keep beating myself up over what happened. I wrote her back, but I never heard from her again. I appreciated her writing me about the dream, but I already know without any doubt that Bella is in heaven." So hopefully you can bear with me. I thought I could do this all in this last part 4, but it's going to need to be 5 parts. I've pretty much done 6 chapters every video, and I've just done 6, and there's only 5 more, but I don't think we can do 5 more without making this an over an hour video. So I'm going to do part 5, and we're going to start at the sentencing. Is chapter 24. We're going to go through the end of the book, and I will have that one out by Sunday evening. And there's a lot to talk about anyway on the sentencing. I was actually there and one of the people that got into the courtroom, and I was also at the press conference. So we'll start there, and then it goes through the end of the book. It goes through his family and his letters to his family and prison life, and then his final confession. So we'll do that one on Sunday. Also, I'd like to ask you guys have been great with your comments. If you could also drop in the comments below what you'd like us to do next. We do have a couple of short videos we're going to do on different parts of the discovery, because I think, like I said before, it's easier to piecemeal because there's just so much to it. But I also thought about doing something like this for Nicole Kessinger's interviews. So let me know if that'd be something you'd be interested in listening to. I will definitely do it if you want me to. I don't want to suffer through that length of time with her voice if it's not something you'd be interested in. I'm just kidding. That was petty. But anyway, if that's something you're interested in, I will start working on that when I get done with part 5. Thank you for giving us a little bit of your time today, and please don't forget to like the video and subscribe.